Let's check out the solution challenge.
Let's do this.
Okay, I'll present my screen.
Welcome to the Google Developer Student Club's 2021 Solution Challenge. The mission of this challenge is to use Google technology to solve for one of the United Nations' 17 Sustainable Development Goals, aiming to end poverty, ensure prosperity, and protect the planet. Win cool prizes, mentorship from Google, and swag. Get help along the way from Google at training events, code labs, and hackathons. Submit your solution by March 31st, 2021. Register today. We can't wait to see what you build.
Let's get started. Seorang developer karena desainer bisa Android teknologi. Awalnya Hastu bukan merupakan seorang yang percaya diri, namun setelah dia ikut DSC, dia menjadi lebih percaya diri dan lebih tertarik untuk mendalami skill di bidang pemrograman Android. Saya belajar membuat aplikasi untuk membuat orang yang berpikir seperti saya. Saya bangga dengan Hastu karena selama Hastu join di DSC, dia memiliki progres yang cukup signifikan. Aku sudah bisa jadi dari DSC.
When I came to first year, I found it difficult navigating a lot of facilities on campus. Most first year students, they found it a major challenge. So I said, okay, this is something that we really need to solve. The DSC is a community where students who are like-minded come together to learn technologies in cloud, Android development, and web development. So after a few workshops, I figured that we could solve accessibility for first year students. We decided to use the more as a use case to build a navigation system using AR technology. At first, people were like, this is really a complex problem to solve. But then after we broke the problem down, we realized that all the technologies we had to use, we had already learned them in our DSC workshops.
When I heard about it, I was like, David, I need to join this project because I was lost basically the entire first academic year. And that's what DSC does. It gives you a project and it makes sure that you are well equipped to work on the project.
So we had a lot of volunteers and we broke them into teams. First, we had a Blender team to get a 3D model of the building. Then we had the Unity and Scripted team who got the models and made it interactive and available to the Android team, who built the screens and the app and used Firebase, which stores user data and for business analytics. And we had a UI team who created a designer set and all the dynamic interfaces you see. Last, we had a documentation team who put everything into one file to make it available to the open source community.
My name is Paul and I study chemistry. I got inspired by attending one of the DSC seminars.
I'm actually very impressed about my brother's journey here because I, as a computer science student,
I just have to focus on the PC parts, computer building apps, but he has something else to do. But he's still taking some time off to help us, and he's really doing a good job. Now I can build Android apps. That means I can use that as a part-time job, and maybe chemistry as my full-time job, or maybe the vice versa.
There were times that we had to meet in the evenings. There were times we had to meet early in the morning just to get the project working.
It was hard, but then we looked at the bigger picture and realized that, okay, we can do this. So, yeah. DSC is a family, and it's about the learning of teamwork and leadership.
What we've built is not a perfect app, but we've come a long way by being able to use the knowledge that we gain from our DSC workshops. My God, this is cool. Who wouldn't love this?
Saya dilahirkan di Bojonegoro. Ibu saya mendidik saya boleh bermain, tapi bermainnya itu nggak boleh jauh-jauh. Saya melihat kakak saya kebanjiran, yang paling parah itu tahun 2007, di mana rumahnya itu sangat tenggelam, banyak korban jiwa yang ditimbulkan, dan kakak saya itu kehilangan.
Kemarin ya lumayan, kemarin. Ya.
Kalau airnya semakin tinggi kan, nggak bisa lalu lintas kendaraan kan nggak bisa lewat, kita biasanya pakai perahu. Palingnya kalau udah agak parah lagi kita ngungsi.
Warga juga pasti resah, kalau enggak sebelumnya belum diberitahu kan resah. Kalau sudah diberitahu kan nanti ada persiapan.
Saya ketika kuliah di PENS ini, saya pertama kali tahu DSC itu dari Dana. Seharusnya kita bisa menghindari hal buruk terjadi ketika kita mengetahui apa yang akan terjadi. Dana membantu saya sekali dalam hal tersebut bersama tim untuk membuat aplikasi Float.
Alatnya itu bersifat kayak misal di sini bakalan ada banjir, dari pemerintah bakalan langsung, tidak berdasarkan yang sebelumnya berdasarkan data kami, itu berdasarkan dari WhatsApp. Nanti setelah itu penduduk bisa ke posko terdekat. Di sini ada lokasi-lokasi poskonya. Terus kita bisa kayak ngeset arahnya belok kiri maupun belok kanan gitu ada. Karena kita memanfaatkan teknologi arahan juga dari Google. Oke, sudah selesai?
Oke, selesai. Kemudian kita mencoba ke sana, kita menunjukkan ke warga Bojonegoro.
Kalau sekarang kalau ada aplikasi ini kan bisa langsung masuk ke HP-nya masing-masing. Jadi semua warga otomatis langsung tahu.
Di sini kita milih Balai Desa
Mulia Agung,
ya. Arah. Ya. Di sini kita bisa lihat di posko ini ada berapa banyak orang.
Membantu banget berarti ya, sangat amat membantu.
Iya. Ini rencana emang akan kami rilis ke Bojonegoro.
Oh gitu ya.
This is the power of DSC. Students all over the world, we can learn and teaching together and also to solve local problems.
Dengan adanya aplikasi Float ini, saya merasa sangat senang sekali saya bisa membantu warga masyarakat Bojonegoro, terutama untuk kakak saya.
Good evening, DSC. Welcome back to Funky Flutter February, and we hope you're ready for our last talk of the day. Earlier, we had a look at different state management tools with Sir Joni.
Tonight, we're going to take a look at APIs on the rise.
Young but experienced, Sir Joshua de Guzman holds the expertise as a Google developer expert for Flutter and Dart, along with writing tech articles and contributing to open source projects during his free time. Out of the passion to help those in the community, he developed mobile apps for large companies like Freelancer.com and Better Banking. And not only that, he founded Flutter Philippines. So now let's welcome
Sir Joshua de Guzman. Okay. Okay. So I think some of our participants just attended the Skills Level Up talk. And before we begin your talk, Sir Joshua, we have a question for you, as well as audiences who can offer their advice as well. So Our question for you is, what advice can you give to developers who are looking to build resumes, and what was your experience in it as a new dev? And can you, it would be great if you could give us some advice, Sir Joshua.
You could also keep the background if you want.
That was a great background, Sir Joshua.
You're muted, sir.
You're muted, sir.
Okay. Yeah.
All right.
Start with this one, and yeah, if things get serious, we can just move this later. Yeah, at least for the question, for people who are probably new to Flutter, what I advise is, like Sir Johnny's talk earlier is regarding block. It's about state management. I think one recommendation that I always have for beginners is to start small. So for example, you can start with, before you can start with block, you can probably start with other state management like provider or scope model. And also block is a good option, especially if you try to advance. For example, if you're really working for a company in the industry, block is a good state management approach if you're working in teams. So all I can say again, for those who just want to start with Flutter, start small, and just build awesome apps and experiment with the UIs. I think that's a good step.
Thank you very much for sharing your experience and your advice, Sir Joshua. We'll be sure to take it and keep it in mind for the future.
All right, so let's now give Sir Joshua the virtual stage. It's time for APIs on the rise.
Okay. Great. Oops, why is that? Great. Let me just split the screen so I can check it. Yep. Okay, I can start now. Great. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. I think it's been a great weekend for everyone. I think there's been a lot of ESE events today. So first is Sir Johnny, and the other one is related as well for the ESE Solution Challenge. But yeah, at least you guys are still here and wanted to learn how you can connect your Flutter apps to web services like APIs, RESTful APIs using GraphQL, and different endpoints. Yeah, at least for the context of this talk, this is more of coming from a perspective of a front-end developer. Meaning, if you already have a Flutter app and you wanted to use this Flutter app or integrate this Flutter app to connect, for example, to existing web services like, for example, Twitter or GitHub GraphQL specification, or even to your own websites, then now this talk is for you. You'll be able to read, manipulate, create, update, delete data using GraphQL, especially tailored for Flutter application. So again, before we deep dive with GraphQL, let's try first to understand why are we even here? Like, why should we learn APIs or GraphQL in the first place? Well, at least in the context of DSC Solution Challenge, sustainable goals, you'll probably likely be tasked to create a viable or a meaningful application that is dynamic, that is somehow connected to data sources in the network, and a lot more sources, especially for those data that is large enough that is not suitable for your mobile devices to store on its own. So basically, your goal here is to create a dynamic application. And oftentimes, if not all of the times, oftentimes these applications, which we call dynamic applications, are powered by RESTful APIs. And APIs are literally free and everywhere, and at least most of them are free. So if you're working for a company, you'll probably also be dealing with multiple APIs within your platform. So at least some of the free APIs that you can use for the solution challenges, you can retrieve data from NASA, UN data itself. You can train, you can communicate with your data models, machine learning models in TensorFlow, Twitter, GitHub, and a lot more. And on top of that, APIs allows our app to be dynamic in a way that it can help you create user-generated content. So, for example, this is a person that tries to share a tweet using the Twitter platform as a social media platform. And like without APIs, it will be difficult for an app to store, to share this data on to everyone. Like basically, static apps are just like using apps that basically doesn't connect to any server. But with APIs, your app can stay relevant. Like there you can partner with like your content creators that can publish content on your behalf, and basically like people will drive the traffic to your website. So that's kind of like one of the benefits of a dynamic application. And behind these, like we've been talking a lot about APIs. But what is RESTful API really? Like at least in a nutshell, if you try to look at this diagram, the web browser here, the web app or browser, this can also refer to client side, or if you're in a mobile space, this can refer to a mobile app that connects to a server or to a database through an API. So just to give you how the request happens. For example, you visit a specific website, you posted a new feed on your timeline, you are sending that request. And on that request, if you are connected to the internet, it will communicate to an API. And this API, the web app, the client is not directly connected to the database, but it's connected through an API, which is, like an interface that connects to the web server, which then processes, whether these requests is coming from, like an authenticated user, an anonymous user. Is this request valid? All of those processes and validations will happen on the web server. That is something that we will not try to discuss in detail because like we only have limited time and we're focused not to learn GraphQL in a context of front-end development. And the web server is the one communicating with the database. And if all goes well, whether it's a success or whether it's an error response, the app or the client should be able to receive a response from the server. So this is accompanied by the different status code and more, and messages. Okay, so this is just an example of RESTful API, where that shows a JSON format. So this is how you would typically see a structure of a response from a RESTful API. So this is actually invalid. There should no be comma there. But try to think of it. It's just a key value pair. So we have a name, we have a value for the name, we have a parameter, we have a value for that parameter. So it's kind of like just a key value pair for the JSON object. And on top of that, like as you can see here, this is what you call JSON object. But on this note, like there is an extra bracket, opening and closing brackets. These are what you call JSON array of objects, or array of JSON objects. So whatever, like depends on how you would call it, but you get the point. So we have two types of objects. We have the JSON object and the ones with array of JSON objects. And with APIs, it allows you not only to like connect your Flutter application to your server, but in the future, if you want to connect more applications, like using other tools like apps or tools like in JavaScript, Java, you can also use your existing APIs to connect and display them or manipulate the data on these platforms. So the REST APIs is what makes it more robust and future-proof somehow, because it's agnostic, it's platform agnostic. Any platform for the front end can use it. But at least in our case, we will be using Flutter and GraphQL to communicate with these APIs. And yeah, like we're now on GraphQL. So GraphQL, like if you try to think of it, like this is an example of me trying to manipulate the structure. So we'll not try to deep dive right now with the exact thing that is happening here on the GraphQL. But as you can see here, I'm trying to add more properties. I'm trying to remove some properties and run the query. And as I ran the query, this gave me a response back with the exact structure that I expected to return. So for example, I added launch site, it should return a launch site. I added ID, it should return the ID. But if this is almost similar, and as you can see here, the JSON response is almost similar to RESTful API. Why are we even using GraphQL? Why are we using GraphQL? As you can see here, like, it's not really on the output. It's not just on the output, but also on how you interact with these data. So for example, like, we have this a list of rockets. And if we are returning to the example we have earlier, we have here an array of JSON objects. Well, you might be thinking, why can't I just add all the properties? Like, I can just simply add the launch ID, the launch history, the comments, everything attached to this specific rocket object. But as you try to think of it, like, this is actually wasting a lot of resources, especially for mobile. Like, at least for desktop and web browsers, they are using, like, laptops, desktop computers, which has a lot more power and probably connected to an outlet. But for mobile phones, like, these things, like, for example, if you're wasting a lot of resources, like, these consume a lot of like, waste a lot of resources, like data, the battery of the device. I mean, like, at scale, like, if you only have one API, I mean, it's just fine. But if you have in context like RESTful API, you will have a lot of endpoints. Now, this is just one example of an API. At the same time, the opposite of overfetching can happen. So overfetching is when there's too much data coming from a single endpoint. But for the underfetching, it's like, if the data is not enough to satisfy that endpoint. So for example, we'll have this rockets endpoint, but it only returns name, ID. Like, you're thinking that maybe this will somehow optimize the request, but in reality, you will end up chaining, or the front end developers are forced to chain APIs. So for every rockets, you will be fetching the images by passing rocket ID is equal to 1, and this will return your image URL or rocket ID. So that's API chaining, which is also a problem if if you have a ton of APIs already in your app, then you have to maintain these API chaining in terms of like their backwards compatibility, in terms of like how are they versioned, and so on and so forth. So those two challenges, overfetching, underfetching resources, and API chaining, is what we hope to solve using GraphQL. There's a lot more deep dive comparison between RESTful APIs and GraphQL, but let's just try to focus on what is immediate in terms of like the benefits that we will get from GraphQL. So let's try to open this demo. So hopefully this, okay, it's here. Let me exit this presentation. Okay, so this is, okay, so that's just the right size. Okay, so for the GraphQL, I'm currently visiting this API that's SpaceX.GraphQL. Okay, I'm visiting this API SpaceX. You can also, I've shared the link to the organizer, so you can also play around with it. And, like if you want, so for example, like we have launch pass, if you want to display this, okay, we can just simply see that every data that we specify on this specific object displays it on the response. And with GraphQL, I forgot to mention this, that it only connects to a single API, meaning you don't have to worry whether it's /rockets, /launches. With GraphQL, you will see later that we will only have to connect to a single endpoint. And we are just pretty much going to create these kind of structure and interfaces. So let's try to manipulate this. What if I only want to display a rocket? Or let's say the mission name. Let's start with the mission name. Okay, let's try. Okay, so for the mission name, like it only displays the mission name because we asked it to not just return this data. So this is this is what makes like GraphQL declarative, meaning for a very specific screen. If you only want to display the ID, the mission name, then it makes sense to create that specific query for that screen, because like a user would expect that this screen would only display the previous launches, so whether it has a mission name or ID. And with that kind of notion, like you can also create multiple queries. Like for example, this launches batch, you can also create queries. I'm not sure if I can actually combine them, but okay. Okay, that's one. Okay. So we can, for example, we can have multiple history screen. For example, we can have query for launch, previous launches, launches in homepage. Okay, this is not how I named the, but you get the point. Yes, they are separate requests in main page. Okay, so this is what makes GraphQL powerful. So you can have multiple queries in a single, like in a single query. So you can have multiple queries out of the launches pass. We have created separate queries that I want to display in the home page, and a separate query that I want to display in the main page, which in this case has a ship status, but the other one does not have it. So you kind of like, probably see that we are saving resources in the homepage, which, like for example, if you don't want to display the ships here, then it doesn't make sense to request or to use that resource. At the same time, we mentioned that we have this problem called API chaining. For the API chaining, as you can see here, like we have different objects. So a rocket can be, like there could be separate object for rocket with this per history. For example, we have first page, and this course may have multiple content again. So for API chaining or for RESTful API, you would probably have two APIs for this. So one is for the API for retrieving the previous history, and the other one is retrieving the rocket per history, but again with complexity limit. Okay, but at least for this case, like you would typically just have to let's just load any object here. Okay, so at least with this one, you can just simply chain the APIs. Like instead of creating separate API for previous history and rocket, you can combine them in a single query, which returns to you a beautiful response. Like for every history, I will have a rocket payload, which is again a declarative approach, just like Flutter. Whatever you try to add here is the things that you will be seeing in the response. So that's kind of like how it plays well with Flutter. It's declarative. And just put it in summary, GraphQL is a query language for API. Most of the work here, like the things that there's still a lot of work involved in the backend, but at least for front end, it makes it easier for you to be able to ship more features, more robust products for your clients. Declarative approach for data retrieval and create, update, delete, or data manipulation. And for server side, like for the backend team, they'll be using this Apollo package. So this is probably one of the most famous packages used for GraphQL, but there are also other alternatives depending on the programming language. Apollo is mostly used for JavaScript. For our end, the client side, we will likely be using the GraphQL package or the GraphQL Flutter. And there are also a lot of libraries for the client side. These are just some of them. And GraphQL falls under, has these three concepts. So one is what we call query. This is as you see here, we are using query to retrieve data, meaning GraphQL follows the same constraints of RESTful API. So query, think of it as almost similar to GET requests in RESTful API. So meaning, the GET, the GET constraint in a RESTful API, and the mutation is almost similar to the ones you use for manipulating data on RESTful API, such as put, post, delete, and more. So at least that's how we put it in comparison with RESTful API, query, GET requests, mutation, things that you use this whenever you have to change something from the database. For subscription, we will not try to deep dive on this one, but think of it as a connection to this live instant connection to a server. So it's almost similar to a WebSocket. Okay, but we will not try to deep dive on subscription a lot because we'll not have enough time for that. And for GraphQL is really plays well with Flutter because the kind of the developer productivity it brings. GraphQL is declarative. At the same time, Flutter is declarative. It makes it easier for developer to think how to connect specific APIs, how to display the data, and more. So declarative, it's very straightforward, less cognitive load for developers to think in terms of implementation. And with GraphQL for Flutter, I have to offer two strategies, at least for now. We have this called we call widget-based queries, and we also have this standalone queries, which is using GraphQL package. At least for the widget-based queries, we have these widget-based queries. It's straightforward. It's using widgets, like Flutter widgets, to request data from the internet. So meaning instead of having this kind of clean architecture, you can directly pass on your query into these query options. It is a string, and this query is the one you see here. Okay, so you can just simply copy paste this one and paste it right here without creating data sources, repository, stuff like that. That makes it more complicated. This one is a bit straightforward. I'll recommend this one if you're prototyping, because you can just simply change this without auto-generating models, which you will see later. The other strategy that I'll be teaching you is the standalone queries. So for this standalone queries, instead of adding the queries directly to the widget tree, you can follow principles like clean architecture, in which you can separate the query. You can add the query here, and probably you can place it on a data source layer, a repository layer. And with this one, without touching the UI, you can manipulate the queries on the data source layer. Later, I'll show you that in action. Let's try to run the first project. Hopefully, if you have questions, let me know. We can make it interactive. Okay, let me open up the starter project. I think this is okay. It's actually silent for the right. Great. So with this one, we just have here a simple and very basic application that retrieves data from the internet. So we have, I think the internet here is a bit slow, but yeah, that's a challenge when doing live coding with an API. That happens a lot. Upcoming, oh, we have existing flights here. Okay, I think we have here past mentions. Again, we can start with this one, the history. So at least for the history, if you try to look at this, we are retrieving Starlink 15, Sentinel 6, and if we try to map this specific data from the API, we are using this. Okay, we are using this. So it's a Starlink 15. It's Sentinel 6. So I'm not fooling you. This is coming from the API, which you can play around. And if you try to see the code that we use, history, this is the exact history that I am using. So this is a multi-line string that I'm saving here. So this is a multi-line string. If I try to paste it here, hopefully this works. Okay, it worked. Meaning, whatever I add here, I can just simply paste it here again. For example, let's try to add more properties. Right now, I'm just retrieving the rocket name, the launch, the Flickr images. What other properties can we add? Let's try to see. Like maybe if you have some interesting, like if you have interesting ideas, you can just share it in the comment section. Like you can paste whatever you like, and let's try to add them. Okay, let's just try to add. What things can we add? Probably mission name, launch, maybe the launch success. Okay, I think this is successful. So let's see. By the way, this is an unofficial SpaceX API, but yeah, you can pretty much use it for non-profit projects or experimental projects. So let's see. So launch success is actually successful. So we can use it here, and if we try to copy this query, right now as you can see here, there's no launch success. So let's try to paste it here. Okay, there goes the launch success. It's here. Let's try to restart the app. Okay, so right now it's not here because we're not actually using the property. But if we try to look at how we parse the data here, we have the most basic way to parse it. Like we have this list of launches, and we just get launches pass. Basically, like it returns whatever the name of the query here. So let's just try to print this data so that you'll be able to see it. So let's try to see if the launches pass was added here. It's not here. Maybe because it's not yet loaded. Okay, so I guess it's here. And to see it, let's indent. We can, right now it's really hard to read it from here, but I guess I think we can limit the number of rockets for now, probably one, that we can see that we're actually parsing it in Flutter. So now we're gonna see one response. Okay, it's here, launches pass. Okay, there's just a few error, but that's understandable. So it's here, launch success is here. Meaning, after adding the specific string or parameter, every history now has this property. So, like you don't have to talk again to your backend team to add this specific property on this query, because as a front-end developer, you can design the query that you want for a specific page. So let's try to display the value of launch success. Maybe we can add another property here, perhaps. I'll just probably be adding, let's try to add here. And on top of the name, or on top of the rocket na lang. Okay, so let's try to copy the text. Is successful. Right now we are about to parse new data. Is successful. We have it here. So every item here is updated. Next is we have to parse or get the value. So this is the easiest way not to get or to parse the data or to serialize the data, like, because you serialize the data because, like, this is the easiest, but it's not probably, like after the prototyping stage in your DSC solutions challenge, you might want to opt in to the other strategy that I'll be showing you in a few. So for this one, it works fine for these kind of small applications because like you can basically like change it on the fly. So for example, I'm not sure what property launch access. We only have to retrieve it on the launch object. So I'm currently calling the launch object. So as you can see here, the launch object is for every launches or for every launch, like this launch history has, like we talked about this earlier, the JSON array. This launch is equivalent to a single JSON object. So meaning like this launch object here, final launch, just means these, either the first or the following items. So for every, like we're talking for every launch object, we will be checking whether the launch is successful or not. So let's try to restart or hot restart. So it's true, like most of them is successful. So again, that's just how easy it is not to retrieve data using GraphQL in Flutter. It's very straightforward, but this is the easiest. But like we'll have to discuss the next strategy so that you'll avoid more errors in the future. Like for this one, it's easy to get errors here because, for example, if I've added like wrong spelling here, if I try to restart the app, like it'll probably throw off an error, like for example null, because this property does not exist. So like it's easy to make mistakes, especially if you're working in teams. You don't know how to keep tracks. It will be difficult for you to keep track of everything, but this is the easiest way for prototyping. GraphQL widgets based strategy. Again, that's launch as pass, and we just parse the data. And to give you the query itself, it's just very straightforward query widget. So it's like it's like container, it's like future builder, but it's named query. So for the query, we just pass it here in the GQL, and you don't have to deep dive on this too much, but to give you a context, this is just responsible for evaluating what query, or if this query is valid, and if it's valid, it will just try to send that to the single endpoint that we have on the app. Okay, let's try to visit. Let's try to visit how we are connecting. So now you see, how easy it is to connect to GraphQL. Let's try to see how is it currently set up. So as mentioned earlier, we only have one API for GraphQL, which is most commonly added on the main file of your app. Okay, main app. So basically, like we have here a single endpoint, and we are creating a connection to a GraphQL client. Under the hood, you can also change the HTTP clients that you use. But right now, we can just simply use this very basic setup that we have here. And it connects an instance to your GraphQL endpoint, like on app start. And after that, you will just have to provide these instance of the client through the entire application of your Flutter app. So meaning this client that you instantiated on the main function can now be used by a lot of all of your pages. So in this one, this can be used here. The query widget. We also have users page. We also have upcoming page, and so on. So if you try to see here, like earlier we mentioned, this is the query widget, which is responsible for the get requests. We also have here mutations. So mutations, this is a way for us to be able to manipulate data on the database. So for this one, let's try to update this. Whoever owns this, I'll be updating you. Test 2, funky Flutter. So everyone, if you are testing, let's just try to spam the server. Kidding. But yeah, the other users will actually see it. Flutter, H, and Flutter. Okay. And if you try to refresh it, this should refresh, but it's not. Let's try to see. I think that should be saved from the server. Let's try to retrieve it from the users. Okay, we can actually copy the users. So yeah, we can copy users here. So that's the power of GraphQL. You can copy users and cross-match the data. So yeah, remember in RESTful API, you would typically have to, like set up a lot of endpoints for each of the things that you're about to test. With this one, you can just go back and forth between Flutter and GraphQL. So for GraphQL, it's an interface for interacting with your GraphQL database or API. So this one, I think it's not saved. Okay, I think it's not saved. Oh, it's here. Okay, so our data is actually saved. So feel free to use the app. I will be sharing later, and yeah, type funky Flutter. Okay, I think it's here, but for some reason, I think there's a difference in ordering, perhaps. Okay, it's here. And we can also delete. Let's just try to delete this first for the meantime. Or update this. Update S2. And we'll try to run the query. Okay, it's updated. See? And we only use 2 queries for that. So the first one is the query for retrieving the list of users. Meaning, for the list of users, we just have to use query as the keyword and the users. This is a custom name, but oftentimes I have to just name them similarly if I'm using widget-based strategy, since this will just only be placed in a single location. So if you try to see it here, it has a similar setup with the launch history. So with the query widget, we will be passing the string query. So the string query is this one. Okay, this is a string query, and if you pass it, this will evaluate if the if the query is valid or not, or if it has the data or not. If it's loading, we will be showing a loading indicator, as you can see here. Try to restart the app. So similar to Feature Builder, it has this. You can subscribe to whether the state is loading or not, and we have here the resulting data, which is the users. So it's almost visible here. We have data and users. So we have an array of JSON objects for the users. And if we try to display the data, we're just simply adding the ID, adding the rocket name and the Twitter handle in here. So this is the Twitter. So most of them are null, but at least for the funky Flutter, we have a Twitter handle. Okay, and if we try to update, this is a different screen. So if you try to press this one, this is going to be redirected to to the update user screen. So we have here a navigation. So for on tap, we have here a update user screen. So for the update user screen, it almost has a similar setup, except instead of having a query, we have here a mutation. So for the mutation, we will be calling the update users. So update users query, and we have this. I'm not sure if I can actually paste this directly here. Okay, it works. It's just that you have to change this. Because not like you have to update it manually. So we can change. We can change the funky Flutter here. We just have to copy the ID. We should just change the Twitter name to funky Flutter. We have the rocket. Like rocket, funky rocket. And the funky name. Okay, that's a straightforward way of. Okay, so it's not actually named. No, it's named. Suspected name. So there's an error. Okay, there's an error. Let's try to evaluate this properly. Okay, I'll see the error. Users 55, let's 55. There has been. Okay, now we are experiencing some error. Set error funky where ID is equivalent to this. So I guess it's just lacking. What is it found? So let's try to. I'm confused about the long parameter. Let's see. So where? Okay, so that's just. Okay, right. It's just lacking a couple of brackets. Okay. Now. It's actually. Let's try to restart this. Oftentimes, like update user. Okay. Update users. Okay, it's actually there. So let's try to see where it went wrong. I think this one is the set. Okay, let's just try to copy the set here. And the where is the ID. Yeah, I think there's just been a couple of use copy pasting, because in Flutter these are variable, like to escape this string as variables. Basically these are coming from the previous page that we had as we tried to update so at least for this one, like there's no similar syntax in terms of like escaping the characters, because we are adding them explicitly here. Okay, I think that's great, except for the returning. Okay. It doesn't just have an in test. Update user. Okay, I guess. Or maybe there's a. Okay. Right. Maybe this is an old one. Where ID? Okay, I have been having tech issues here for the IDs. It's a very long string. Okay. Okay, I guess. Okay, there are a lot of brackets. There are a lot of brackets, man. Like, okay. I guess I can just simply update this ID is equal to, like we can just simply copy this ID equivalent. Okay, today I learned. Okay, this should update the user. Okay, it's updated. That took a while. I think there's been some issues with this curly braces. Right now, I don't have. This is just the default client for GraphQL, but yeah, it works great. So we are now updating this value. And if we try to update this again, like this is now different and updated. Let's just try to restart it. So again, for Flutter, for GraphQL for Flutter, we have these core principles. First is query. The next one is mutation. You can also use the mutation for deleting users, but not sure. Yeah, there are actually methods here. So we have insert users and delete users. So we haven't tried insert user. I guess it's here. Okay. So I guess we already have it, but we haven't seen the API. So for the add user, okay, we have the add user screen. So we are using the insert user mutation. So again, this is just a variable. We just escape it. It's coming from this screen. So whatever you name added here, test1, test2, test3, these are just parsed as or escaped as variable, and they will be added at the end of the list. Okay, this one. Great. So most of the things that you have seen right now are just queries in GraphQL, but widgets, I believe they have been well discussed to you yesterday, Mr. Harvey. So, in the sample code, you'll see it in action, the different widgets that we use. At least for now, the takeaway for this first strategy is to handle, if try to summarize it, just connect to a single endpoint. Oftentimes you'll only have to connect to a single endpoint. You'll provide the GraphQL client all in the main file, and this client will now be used for multiple parts of your app. So, for example, we have it on the add user screens, we have it on the history screen, and the core principles that we have discussed so far are the query and the mutation. So again, for the query, this is a principle of GraphQL in which you are able to retrieve data from the internet or from the API. But for mutation, it's used for manipulating data. So whether you want to create a new object, update an existing object, or delete a record from the database, that's the time you have to use mutation. Basically, you can also use you can also use mutation for retrieving queries, but semantically, it's not actually, even if for other, I think this doesn't allow it, but for some API services that you might be using, there are maybe some get queries that you can use inside mutation. Just try to use a query for that one because it's much less, it's much less vulnerable in terms of the query limits the access to this request to get request only. These for the things that you have to do in terms of the manipulation, just use the query. Okay, so that's the first approach. It's very straightforward. You don't have to, you don't have to use any state management. You don't have to use a clean architecture. You'll just add strings and parse it inside a single screen. Let's try to close this, and let's try to open the next project. Actually, let's just try to. Here I have some error for this one. Okay, let's just try to open this one. Okay. APIs on the rise. Okay, let's go topic title. Okay, let's just. Again, let's just try to build it. So right now what you'll see is a simple browsing music artist browsing application. So it's connected to an unofficial GraphQL API again, for Spotify. So if you try to look at these project, first thing that you'll notice is there are a lot of folders. So we'll not try to deep dive what clean architecture is, what repositories, data sources are, but as you can see here, this is following the clean architecture pattern of like the ones we see for projects that like has been working on by teams. Okay, so this one is try to search. If that's the right spelling. Oh, that's actually worked. So right now, that's the only thing that it does. Let's try to see what's the difference between the first strategy, which is the widget-based approach. This one is the standalone GraphQL package. So for this one, earlier we are using GraphQL _ Flutter. You will see it later in the code. But for this one, we're just using GraphQL, meaning we're just using the things that is needed for evaluating a query rather than the widgets. So in a high-level overview, we have here data sources. This is where we are adding the queries. So previously, we are adding them directly here with the UI. So the widgets, the query widgets, they are part of the UI. But in this one, it improves the testability. At the same time, it improves the separation of concern. So the business logic for this strategy is now put or added in this specific layer of our project, which is the data source. And if we try to visit your main page network, we have here instead of providing GraphQL directly on top of the multi-provider, we are just providing the GraphQL client as part of the data source. So for the data source, this is where we call the client directly. So previously, the widgets, like the query, the mutation widgets, it handles the connection between the GraphQL itself. But for this approach, the standalone GraphQL package approach, is you're the one that's going to use this GraphQL directly. So for this one, it's just a few lines of code. Again, similar with the query structure, we just have this query. We just have this query, and you can just almost similar with the ones that we have here for the rockets. But for this one, this is for the artist, in which you have to pass a name. So for every name that you pass, it will return you the equivalent artist. So for this one, we just have here a simple search list. So that is handled by the UI. Now it's passed to the state management. Right now we're using Mobex, and the Mobex then pass it to the repository. The repository pass it to the data source. For the data source, this is where we accept the filtering string, and we pass it to the query. So almost similar here, we are just passing a search query here. So if you want specific set of data, for example, you want to limit the data, if the GraphQL query allows it, then just pass it. Like, it makes sense. Like, it doesn't, you don't necessarily have to display all the data if you want to limit this, the data you want to show on the screen. So that's for the query. It's almost similar with the first approach, but again, it's on the data source layer. And we just parse it using client.query. And we are calling this query options directly. So previously earlier we are calling the query widget, but obviously query widget is not available here since we are just using the GraphQL package, which can be ported to Dart, and it's not Flutter specific. So we just pass the name variable here, and we wait for the response. So this is a wait. We wait for the response, and we parse the data. So now, it makes it easier for you to test it, because you can mock the data, for example, like using fake data or fake JSON data, and you can now return the value of that request. Okay, so again, data source is connected to the repository. But again, you don't have to like deep dive with too much with clean architecture. You can just simply add it to the state management directory. But please, you get the sense on how big applications are built in this setup. So this data repository connects to the data source. At the moment, we only have remote data source, which in a repository you can also have local data sources such as caching, data that comes from the local device. But right now we only have remote data source. We call the get artist method. We pass the name, and this repository is now called by store. Yeah, this is now called by the store class. So similar with the workshop of Sir Johnny, store is, you can think of it as the block layer or the controller layer, where you handle most of the business logic, or at least all of the business logic that you have for your app. So with block, it has this block layer that connects to an event or streams the event to the UI. With store, it has this principle of observables, meaning whenever you have these values changes, which can be mutated by an action, they immediately reflect the changes on the UI. So they are reactive in a sense. But like MOVEX is for a different topic. We'll just try to see here where is the GraphQL API is called. So for the search artist, we're almost there. We're now actually here in the presentation. In the presentation of the UI, this is block MOVEX. We're going to controller of the UI. Now we're just calling repository get artist. So for the get artist, we're just waiting either a failure or a list of artists. So this is one of the cool things by using this package, either options, because now instead of checking if either is equal to null, then it makes so much sense to just use this API. So either dot fold. So for dot fold, if it's failing, then you will just have to this is the left hand portion, which is a failure. This is a custom object, and a right hand side of the either, which is the object that you're expecting. So that's a cool thing with repositories using either options. Kind of like makes easier and makes the code much more cleaner, rather than like flagging everything with null, flagging everything with status codes. And for this one, if I think this one is a proof that it is successful, you assign the value, which is a list of artists, in the artist results. And this method is used inside, let's see, where is it? Where it is used. Okay. So for this one, as we open this screen, because this is coming from, so basically this is the home page, but this is the search page, like this artist screen, then now we can start searching for the artist every time these screens open. To be honest, like this could also be improved by adding it inside a future builder. Otherwise, like if there are any other parts of this app that has to rebuild, API will be called again and again. So in the future, we might be wanting to migrate this to a future builder. And the list of objects, almost similar on how you parse the data. It's just added here. So artist results is here. So if you want to remove the results, we can just simply, I'm not sure, where is it? Oh, I think this is running here. And we can just simply show the results here. Okay? Again, the difference between the strategy is, it's probably will be depending on your need. So if it's a prototype project and like you want to finish fast, you can start with the widget-based approach, which I recommend, especially like right now you're just learning what GraphQL is and probably Flutter. So I think this is the very straightforward approach on how you can follow this. You can build this app without too much engineering, over engineering stuff. But I guess if you want to improve the way you do things in code, for example, you want to apply for a job, then I guess it's best to study these standalone approach for the queries, because it makes your app more testable. It separates the concern from the UI, from the controller, and it makes it easier for you to work in teams in that sense. And to wrap up, GraphQL works well with Flutter. It's since the nature of GraphQL, it's declarative. Like think of it as GraphQL declarative in a way that how you request data. At the same time, Flutter is also declarative, so it's kind of like working hand in hand together. So it's actually GraphQL is the perfect alternative for RESTful APIs in Flutter. And there have been a lot of packages. So if you want to support the creators of like the ports of the GraphQL Flutter or GraphQL for Flutter, then you can visit this link. Other than that, like this disease, just like state management, I always advise you to sit down with your team and discuss whether this is a good approach over RESTful APIs. So this will be probably depending on the things that you will be using. So for example, if the API that you are using is SpaceX that uses GraphQL, then it makes sense to use GraphQL. But again, if it uses RESTful API, then you only have limited amount of time, then stick with RESTful API. But at the same time, other things that you learned here from this workshop, like the parsing of JSON object, it's almost similar on how you do it on RESTful APIs, except that with GraphQL, it just has a different way of communicating with the client. But the parsing of data, the serialization, how you display the data, it's almost similar to RESTful API. And in the future, on top of the standalone strategies that we have, you can okay, if you want to advance with GraphQL, consider using Artemis. So right now, as you can see here, we're still using in the data sources, we're still using this string. So what happens is, if you want to migrate, for example, in the future to for example, if you're working with teams and the application that you have is very large, then I think it will be difficult for you to, like test this one. So, and you can also easily make mistakes, like for this one. So what I recommend you is to look for Artemis, which auto-generates these string queries so that other developers in your team will be able to use the strictly type properties of these queries rather than a raw string. And yeah, I've been writing GraphQL at least after a while, after learning it last year. And we have other resources here. I can just simply provide you the link. And yeah, feel free to ask any question if you have any. I think I can share it with the organizers. But yeah, that's pretty much it from my end.
Okay, so thank you, Sir Joshua, for that talk. You really blew us away with your SpaceX demo. Now we know why we should learn REST and GraphQL with Flutter. It's cool that we got a live demo with the different rockets.
So that was wonderful, Sir Joshua. You didn't just help us rise, you launched us out on using different APIs with Flutter. We'll now give a few minutes to our guests and open the floor for questions, so feel free to ask us for your questions.
Actually, there was a question earlier from Don Ramon de Jesus asking, I suppose this is about APIs. Is it similar to JSON?
Similar to JSON, yeah. At least for the response, like for the response. I'm not sure if I can hear. Okay. At least for the response, like it's actually using JSON. So again, as I mentioned earlier, for parsing the data, both from RESTful API and GraphQL, they're almost the same. They just differ mainly on how you request the data. So for the GraphQL, you request data, like on demand. So for example, whatever properties you need. But for RESTful APIs, you are only limited by the properties available from that endpoint. So yeah, for JSON, they are the same for responses.
Cool. So there you have it.
All right.
Yeah.
We'll just wait for if there are any more questions.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think since there are not much people, maybe I can just change my or no.
I love that background.
It's a good background, sir.
Yeah, don't have a good background with me, so yeah.
But that is a good background, though.
Indeed.
Yeah. Not sure if there are any more questions coming, but I'm curious. Like, when is? I think the submission is on March 31, right? Like,
yes. So the submission for Solution Challenge, the deadline is on March 31. So if anyone watching this is planning to join the Solution Challenge, be sure to submit it by then. You can register at goo.go/solution challenge.
all right.
Right.
Okay.
All right. So I guess there's no more questions.
Mhm.
If there are anyone who have questions that they're not able to ask today, you can do so in our Discord server where Sir Joshua is also present, and you can paste your question in the Ask Our Speakers Anything channel.
All right. Yeah, I think it's Saturday night, so
yeah.
Yeah, also make sure to interact with your fellow participants. And also, we have a Code Labs challenge on the Discord server, and those who complete it will receive a certificate. And we already have quite a few finishers already, and it'd be great if you were one of them, and yes, you can be. And JJ?
Yep, and that's it for Funky Flutter Friday. For Funky Flutter February, day 2. API is on the rise. It's not even Friday. My bad. Yeah.
Okay.
So these past few sessions, we learned Dart, Flutter, state management, and just now APIs.
All right, so stay tuned for day 3 as we get you from zero to hero with Flutter.
Funky, groovy.
Have a wonderful evening, DSE Philippines.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.